Hello everyone and welcome back to the Best Facts Apologetics live stream training. This is day 2 of the live stream, so if you've missed anything that we did in our previous day, we covered just kind of an introduction of the material as a whole, and then we dove deep into that first letter of the acronym, the beginning of the universe. So if you missed that, you can find both the live stream and the individual sessions uploaded to our YouTube channel, Great Commission Alliance Media. If you're watching this today live and you want to take notes with what we're doing, you could find the notes PDF that we put together so you can follow along with everything that we're teaching. You can find that in the video description below. Whether you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, you'll be able to find it there. We hope that you guys download that and just fully engage with everything we're doing. If you're having questions about the material today or about apologetics in general or anything we covered yesterday, you could go ahead and put those questions in the comments of the video right now while it's live, and we're going to answer those at the end of these 2 20-minute sessions. We're going to have a 15-minute live Q&A. So hope you guys stick around for both sessions and also stick around for that Q&A and just fully engage with all the awesome content that we're going to get into today.
Welcome back to the Best Facts training. I hope you've been able to catch the first 2 sessions. In the first session, we reviewed the Best Facts acronym. If you missed that, let me just tell you quickly that the Best Facts are 2 words that describe 2 acronyms for the evidence for God and the evidence for the Christian faith, specifically for the Bible. B stands for the beginning of the universe, E, the engineering of the universe, S, standards and morality, and T, the truth about Jesus. F stands for it foretells the future, A, it's archaeologically accurate, C, it's coherent, T, it's translated correctly, and S, there's science in the Bible. We also have the tall tales acronyms for why not other faiths and other worldviews. We'll describe those at a later time. If you missed the first session, you can go back and get that at the Great Commission Alliance YouTube channel. I would also encourage you to pick up the Great Commission workbook called The Best Facts. This is one of our standard resources. It's available at greatcommissionalliance.org/shop. At the same link, you can also get the Best Facts tract. This is a great little tract designed for skeptics. It goes through these arguments in a very coherent and relational way, and it is a really sharp resource. It looks great. Our designer did a phenomenal job on that. Thank you so much, Megan. So anyway, that was the first session. In the second session, we dove into B, the beginning of the universe. It was a great study in the evidence for the beginning of the universe and the reality that that points to a creator. We talked about the cosmological argument. So again, as you study these things, I hope that you'll pick up the Best Facts workbook and the Best Facts tract to share with skeptical friends. You know, today we're going to be jumping into E, the engineering of the universe. In the video description, you'll be able to see a link to notes so that you can follow along and take notes as we do this training together. If you can't find it in the video description, you can always go to greatcommissionalliance.org/training, where we have all of our trainings and the resources associated with those trainings. You can definitely get the notes there as well. Let me start by reading a short little verse that may or may not sound like it has anything to do with the engineering of the universe and the argument for design that points to God. Let me read to you Matthew chapter 6, verse 28. It says, "And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin." And then in 29 it continues, "Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these." And in 30, "If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith?" You know, we see in this verse something that's important to remember. That is that Jesus himself, God in human flesh, governs this universe and holds it all together. He is the ultimate engineer of the universe. So let's jump into the engineering argument for God. You know, there are very many different approaches to the design argument, but they all kind of have some similar elements. They describe the statistics and the fine-tuning and the things like that that point to a designer. You know, when we see design, we inherently believe that there was a designer behind the design. In fact, if you look at a video like this, you'll assume that there's a speaker like me speaking to you and that there was a video camera taking this video and somebody behind it all that made it happen, like our incredible tech guy, Ben. You would be right. When we see design, there is a designer behind it all. But that is a rudimentary view of the design argument. Dr. William Lane Craig does a really good job of explaining this in a logical format. And here is the first premise. The first premise is that the universe is either the product of chance, necessity, or design. We'll get into these more in depth in a minute. The second premise is that the universe is not a product of necessity. Third, the universe is not a product of chance. Fourth, the conclusion, therefore, the universe is a product of design. This is a watertight argument. It's solid, but it's more than just logically solid. It's also intuitive. We recognize this. I'll explain more about that in just a minute. But first, let me tell you about Dr. Antony Flew. He was one of the most famous atheists of the last century before the modern antagonistic atheistic movement of the last 20 years. He recently died, but before that, he went from atheism to theism. One of his last books was God Does Not Exist, and then he scratched out the doesn't on the cover and put God Does Exist. How the world's most notorious atheists came to believe in God. You know, this design argument is what brought Antony Flew to faith. It's what brought him to belief in God. So it is a compelling argument for God's existence, and we're going to go into that in a little more depth today. So let's talk about each of the premises that I just shared with you. First of all, premise number one, the universe is either the product of chance or necessity or design. This is intuitive, and I've never heard someone offer a different alternative. It's either necessity, it's either chance, or it's either design. Usually, the skeptical say it's chance or it's necessity. We're going to explain why that doesn't work in the next one. The next premise is that the universe is not the product of chance. This is very important. Statistics alone don't create anything, right? Statistics don't cause things to happen. They're just understanding the probability of outcomes. And here's another thing that we have to catch here, that we should exist, right? There is no reason statistically that things should be the way they are. I'll explain more about some of the statistics behind this in a minute. But the statistical argument for the cause of the universe, that chance created us, doesn't hold water. Chance can't create anything. The next would be necessity. We're here by necessity. That'd be the next possibility. And our premise number three is that the universe is not a product of necessity, just like it's not a product of chance. There is no reason that we should be here. We don't have to be here. If we were here as a product of necessity, it would not be possible that we would not be here. There would be no other possibility. In other words, it would be naturally and inherently the absolute way that things had to be for us to be here. But we know that's also not the case. In fact, most natural laws really point in the opposite direction. They say we should not be here. Our existence is not necessary. So if our existence is neither the product of chance nor the product of necessity, the only alternative is that it is the product of design. And this is something that I think has a lot of logical strength behind it. Because the atheist, to get out of that conclusion, has to explain why it's the product of chance or the product of necessity, and they fall on both accounts. So this is a logically solid argument, but it's also intuitive, like I said a moment ago. Do you remember in Psalm 19, verses 1 through 2? It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge." When we look at creation and we see design, we naturally realize there's a designer behind it all. There was an atheist once, and we met week after week going over the evidence. We'd go over the cosmological argument, and all these other logical arguments, and creation versus evolution, and all this. And he came back after several months of me not seeing him, and he said, "I believe in God now." I said, "Really? Tell me about it." Of course, I thought it was maybe the arguments or the reasoning of the evidence. And he said, "Well, I was at a party, recently, and I went out on the balcony to smoke a cigarette, and I looked up and I saw the stars. And I said, and then what? And he said, no, I just looked up and saw the stars. I said, okay, and then what happened? Why do you believe in God? And he said, I'm telling you, I just looked up at the stars, and I knew there's a God. That is the intuitive appeal of this argument. People know when they look at the complexity all around us that this did not just happen on accident. And there's no reason we should believe it did. That is intellectually baseless. The person that says that we don't need an explanation for that is crazy. That's not being intellectually honest at all. So there's an intuitive appeal to the design argument. Let me tell you some examples of design in the universe and on our earth and in life itself. The universe seems to be perfectly designed for life on Earth, and Earth is uniquely situated in the universe. Hugh Ross shares some of the following statistics and evidences. The Earth is perfectly located in the only possible intersection of all 9 habitable zones. He includes the water habitable zone, the ultraviolet habitable zone, the photosynthetic habitable zone, the ozone habitable zone, the planetary rotation rate habitable zone, the planetary obliquity habitable zone, the tidal habitable zone, the stratosphere habitable zone, and the electric wind habitable zone. Some of the reasons to realize that our Earth was put precisely in the only place that it could sustain life like ours. You know, as we look around at the universe, there are numerous constants and parameters, some of these from Hugh Ross as well. The distance between stars, the oxygen to nitrogen ratio in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide and water vapor levels in the atmosphere, the ozone level in the atmosphere, the atmospheric electric discharge rate, the ratio of electron to proton mass, the entropy level of the universe, the stability of the proton, the velocity of light, and the weak nuclear force coupling constant. These are just a couple. He goes through many, many more. But if any of these were off by the slightest factor, we couldn't be here today. In other words, chance doesn't explain it, and necessity as well does not explain it. Let me give you some examples of some statistics. Life could not exist on this earth if the gravitational constant was off by 1 in 10 to the 60th power. There have not even been 10 to the 60th seconds in the history of time. So imagine something that small, a change that small in the gravitational constant, none of this would exist. Or take this one, even more outstanding, and there are many just like these. The mass and energy of the early universe had to be evenly distributed to a precision of 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. This number is so astronomically large that I can't even understand it in my head, and probably most viewers can't either. But the reality is, if anything was tweaked, even in the slightest amounts, life on this earth could not be possible, and we would not be here. So we are not here as a product of chance, and we are not here as a product of necessity. Rather, we are here as a product of design. This is true in the cell as well. You know, my undergraduate education, my bachelor's degree was in chemistry. And if any of you have ever taken organic chemistry, you remember all about chirality. And we've all heard of the Miller-Urey experiment where amino acids were created. And you know the secular perspective, the evolutionist perspective that life just popped out of some primordial soup. It drives me nuts, but our Museum of Natural History here has a display. And it says volcanoes plus lightning equals life. It's the most absurd graphic I have ever seen in my life. And if you've ever taken organic chemistry, you would have to agree. It is possible for organic molecules to be created in some kind of situation like that, but that is far from the creation of life itself. You see, when organic molecules are created in nature, they're created in different-handed versions, just like right and left-handed. But to get the simplest life form to come from that, you'd need only one type to link up all together. And we're talking 100,000 amino acids and nucleotide base pairs, all with just one type without the other type getting mixed in. This is impossible out of a 50-50 mix. In fact, statistically, the odds are about 1 in 10 to the 33,000th power. This is so far beyond the realm of possibility that we can't just say it must have happened. And the statistical possibility or probability of the rest of the cell coming together, because that's not even a cell, that's just a random strand of DNA or RNA. But for the rest of the cell and all the parts that it needs, it'd be something like 1 in 10 to the 112,000th power. You'll have to get the Best Facts book to get some of those statistics and their sources, but I'm telling you today that overwhelmingly the statistics tell us that we cannot be here just as a product of chance or necessity. Let me tell you a couple quotes. Here's one from Hugh Ross. He says, "The odds that any given planet in the universe would possess the necessary conditions to support intelligent physical life has shrunk to less than 1 in a number so large it might as well be infinity." You know, Dembski has calculated the universal probability bound at somewhere like 1 in 10 to the 150th power, and that's being generous. These statistics are thousands of times greater than that. In other words, it is statistically impossible that life should be here or that the universe itself should be here today. Robin Collins puts it like this: "The bottom line is that the universe is at least 10 billion orders of magnitude, a factor of 10 to the 10 billion times too small or too young for life to have assembled itself by natural processes." So what happens here is the skeptic appeals to a hypothetical multiverse. They say if we live in an infinite number of universes, then it doesn't matter how improbable the statistics might be, because in an infinite number of universes, even improbable statistics like these would have occurred somewhere. And since we're here, this is where they occurred. You know, you might recognize that as a blind leap of faith, something that they accuse the theist of all the time. This is the ultimate example of blind faith. We don't believe in blind faith. We follow the evidence where it leads, and we believe by faith what we believe based on a foundation of solid truth. The atheist appeal to the multiverse to get out of statistics is blind faith, if ever there was such a thing. See, there's no evidence for a multiverse. Scientifically, we can't test it, we can't observe it, we can't go to it. So we can't know it. Even if it did exist, it would need an explanation itself, so it wouldn't get the atheist out of God. But appealing to this to get out of statistics tells us a whole lot about their perspective. It tells us that they are being disingenuous when they try to refute the design arguments for God. Physicist Paul Davies says this: "There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming." Fred Hoyle, I shared this quote last week, says, and he's an atheist, by the way, an atheist astronomer. He says, "A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." As a response to some of these statistics, there was a movement called the intelligent design movement. A lot of universities and a lot of scientists begrudgingly tried to get rid of the intelligent design movement, saying it was just a creationist movement. You know what? They were appealing to some of these very scientific reasons and statistics in a scientific way that described the reality that there is a designer behind it all. And they were right. And they are right. It's not over by any means. So in conclusion, the design argument for God's existence is compelling. Either we're here as a result of chance, necessity, or design. We are not here as a result of chance. There's no statistical cause for the universe. In fact, the universe couldn't just cause itself out of nothing statistically. There's also no reason that we would believe that the universe is necessary, especially because nothing can't create something, like we discussed in the first beginning of the universe session. Nothing can create something. So the universe is not here as a product of chance. It's not here as a product of necessity. So the only other option is that it is here as a product of design. This is a strong logical argument, but it's also a strong intuitive argument. I think when we share this in evangelism, we want to appeal to that with people. Most people, if they're honest with you, know that you don't get something from nothing, and you don't get incredibly complex design and tremendous amounts of information from nothing. These things are intuitive, so appeal to that. Alvin Plantinga called it a properly basic belief, a famous philosopher, saying that belief in God is properly basic. If you have a correct view of the universe, how could you not realize that there's a God behind it all? He was one famous philosopher that recognized these facts, as was René Descartes, and as have been many others. The evidence is compelling. We are here because of a designer, and the design we see all around us points us to that designer. I hope you got a lot out of this session. We are going to be doing more sessions. In the next session, we're going to be talking about standards and morality and how the moral argument points us to God as well. Definitely don't miss that. Go to YouTube, to the Great Commission Alliance Media channel, and get these trainings and so much more. Definitely don't miss the rest of the Best Facts training. Thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome back to another Best Facts training. I am thrilled that you're sticking with us, getting some solid apologetics training. This is going to be a great session. Today we're going to be talking about the moral argument. That is the S, Standards and Morality section of the Best Facts acronym. If you've missed the last trainings, let me catch you up to date on the Best Facts. The Best Facts are two words that describe two acronyms. The first for God's existence and the second for our faith, specifically evidence for the Bible. BEST stands for B, the beginning of the universe, E, the engineering of the universe. That was the last session. S, standards and morality, and T, the truth about Jesus. All these things point us to the reality that there is a God. The next are F, the Bible foretells the future. A, it's archaeologically accurate. C, it's coherent. T, it's translated correctly. And S, there's science in the Bible that points to its divine inspiration. You know, we also will get into the tall tales acronyms at the very end of the sessions. Those describe why we don't believe other worldviews. That will come later. I want to remind you that as we do Christian apologetics, we want to keep the focus on why we believe what we believe, not just attacking the other people because they don't have good evidence. I hope you're getting a lot out of this. You can get a PDF where you can be taking notes as we go through this in the video description. If you have trouble finding it there, you could always get that and everything else you need with this training and all of our trainings at greatcommissionalliance.org/training. You know, you can get all these videos, all moral argument. Let me read to you from Mark chapter 10, and we're going to start in verse 17. As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "Good teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "Why do you call me good?" Jesus answered. "No one is good except God alone." You know, I'm going to end there, but I want you to catch something. Jesus tells us in this passage that only God is good. I believe, side issue, that Jesus was referring to his own deity here. He wasn't refuting the idea, but he was connecting himself with God himself. Okay, but going beyond that, Jesus tells us that only God is good, and that's what I want you to catch. If anything in this universe is truly and objectively right or wrong, there has to be a standard of right and wrong outside of ourselves. Let me clear up some terms. Subjective means in the subject. So if I tell you chocolate is better than vanilla, that is a subjective statement. It's in my own self. It's my own preference, and it might be different than your preference. So taste is subjective. That's very different than an objective truth. Objective is not inside the subjects. It's outside of us. I think we would all agree that torturing babies is wrong. And I think that we would all agree that feeding orphans is good. Those are objective truths outside of ourselves. They are not just preferences. What we have to recognize is if anything is truly objectively right or wrong, it points us to a standard of right and wrong outside of ourselves. And that standard is what we believe to be God. That's what Jesus was referring to when he said only God is good. So let's dive into these topics a little bit more, because if anything is right or wrong at all, objectively, it points us towards God. And it is a compelling argument for God. The moral argument, as stated by Dr. William Lane Craig, goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. This is actually a compelling logical argument. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, was a famous atheist, a skeptic, and this argument led him to believe in Jesus. I'll share his direct quote on that topic in just a moment. But in more recent times, it also convinced Dr. Francis Collins, one of the most important scientists of the last century, who led the Human Genome Project and now directs the National Institutes of Health. It led him to faith in Christ out of his atheism and skepticism as well. This is a logically compelling argument. But before we go any further, I want to clear something up. When we talk about the moral argument for God's existence, we are not saying that only Christians can be moral. Of course, an atheist can be moral. Of course, an atheist can have ethical standards. It's even possible for an atheist to be more ethical than a Christian. Imagine that. But the fact that anything is ethical, the fact that there is anything that is morally right or morally wrong at all, that fact points us to a standard outside of ourselves. So we're not saying that atheists can't be moral, but we're saying that if anything is truly morally right or wrong, that points to a standard outside of ourselves, namely God. So let's jump into this a little bit more. Let's talk about each premise here. This is a logically sound argument, and the atheist can get out of it, but they kind of have to give up a lot to get out of it. So premise number 1 goes like this. It says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, the atheist can get out of this, but to get out of this, they have to have a different cause or a different source for morality other than God. So I debated an atheist several years ago on my radio show on this topic. And he said, I absolutely believe that there are objective values and duties. He is a vegetarian and an animal rights activist. I respect him tremendously as a philosopher and as a human being and as a friend. But he said, I just believe that objective moral values and duties are brute facts. They just are. We don't need an explanation for them. They just are. We don't need God to describe them. They just exist. And I said, well, if objective moral values and duties just exist and don't need an explanation, would you be okay with me saying God just exists and does not need an explanation? He said, of course not. I said, well, then I can't let you get away with that here. We can't just say that there are objective moral values and duties, but they don't need an explanation, right? There are objective moral values and duties, and I believe they point straight at God. So let's review premise 1 and then go on to premise 2. Premise 1 says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. I don't believe that there's a good refutation of that. The brute facts approach doesn't work. So what a lot of atheists will do is attack the second premise. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Most atheists will say, no, they don't exist. Let me read to you what Dawkins says on this topic. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. This is where the atheist has to go if they want to get out of the existence of God. They say there are no objective moral values and duties. In fact, all these things that we call right and wrong are just subjective preferences, for example. This is not true. We all know that torturing babies is always wrong. We all know that what Hitler did, how he killed millions of Jews, how he killed gypsies, how he even killed homosexuals, and so many others. We know that that was wrong. We also know that what Mother Teresa did, feeding orphans, was right. We can't just say none of these things are right and none of these things are wrong. Dawkins himself refuses to debate Dr. William Lane Craig and other apologists. The reason that he gives for that is that they defend the Old Testament conquest of Canaan, which he says was immoral. So in his own unwillingness to debate them, he states that he has a view of objective morality. But then he tells us in his writing that there is no such thing. Let me tell you straight what's happening here. He is trying to get out of the evidence for God by saying there's no such thing as objective moral values and duties, but then he's unwilling to live his life based on that supposed reality. He knows certain things are right and certain things are wrong, just like you and I do. If someone lies about you, you know that you were wronged. If someone robs you, you know that you were wronged. If you see someone in need, you might feel compelled to help them because you know that that is right. We live our lives every day with the knowledge that there is right and there is wrong. These aren't just opinions. These aren't just subjective statements. These are objective realities. And the fact that they exist points us to a standard outside of ourselves. So here's what C.S. Lewis said about this. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. Just how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense." He realized that he could not continue his atheistic view of morality because it realized that it pointed him to a God. He did the right thing. He put his trust in Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. You know, some people will come up with rebuttals saying different societies don't agree on what's right and wrong. But, of course, that's true. But usually that's a matter of definition. I don't know of any societies that think murder or torturing babies is right. But sometimes different societies, jihadis, extremists, would agree that it's wrong to murder one of their friends, but they would define it differently as it applies to others that maybe aren't jihadis. So they have a different definition, but they would probably agree that murder is wrong. I at least hope they would. Okay, so we know that objective moral values and duties do exist, and we know that that points us to God. Things that try to get us out of that won't work. People naturally know that there is a God, and that He is the ultimate judge of what is right and wrong, and that we'll stand accountable to Him. All right, just because some people are ignorant of morality or have different opinions doesn't get rid of morality, just like people that are bad at math doesn't get rid of math. There are certain things that are true regardless of our disagreement about them or our understanding of them. So here are some different approaches. Different people will try to approach this with some explanations for morality. Most of these next ones I'm going to share with you are subjective. Take, for example, the idea that logic provides the basis for morality. This was the view of Kant, and it was the basis for his categorical imperative. Most people would try to say that this is an objective approach to morality, but it's not, because different people using the laws of logic come to very different conclusions about what's right and wrong. One of my philosophy professors would always try to make the case logically that abortion was right. And I believe that I can make the case logically that abortion is murder. So both people using logic came to very extremely different conclusions. Utilitarianism tries to tell us that we should do whatever is in the greatest common good. But of course, how we define that is going to be different from person to person or society to society. Evolutionary morality is pretty common now. You'll hear this, that evolution has conditioned us to have certain morals. Well, even if that were true, that wouldn't be an answer for morality. It would just explain how we got where we are today and that we feel certain ways. It wouldn't tell us that rape is wrong, just that we feel rape is wrong. But at the end of the day, that's also faulty. It is a genetic fallacy. I can't get into that deeper right now, but also it just doesn't make sense because many of the things that would contribute to the survival of the fittest would be the opposite of the things that we call morally and ethically responsible today. The moral basis in evolution does not exist, and I believe evolution itself is not valid. We'll get into that at a later date. Social contract theory says whatever a society deems right is right. Of course we know that's wrong. Not many people believe Hitler was right in what he did. Social contract theory is subjective. Ethical egoism. Do whatever's in your best interest, and that'll end up being the best for everybody else. It's inherently subjective. Virtue ethics, this ancient philosophy as well, how we determine what's right and what's wrong and how we ought to live is going to differ. Those things are subjective. Objective views like maybe the brute fact theory that I just explained to you, which I don't think is able to be supported, or divine command theory. That's what we're left with. The idea that God himself alone, a standard of what is right and wrong, can give us a description of what is right and wrong. You know, that's where we as Christians end up, divine command theory. We believe in a God that gave us a description of what is right and wrong, and that he did that in the Bible. So I want to make this distinction here. When we defend the moral argument for God's existence, at this point, it is just a description of why we believe in God. We are not saying what is right and wrong, just that if anything is right and wrong, it points to God. Some people are going to say, well, why do you believe in the Christian view of what's right and wrong? Well, we're going to get into the FACTS acronym soon, which describes why we can believe and trust the Bible. And if we can believe and trust the Bible, then we can believe and trust that what it says is right and wrong is true. And you know what? I believe we all know that what it says is right. To love your neighbor as yourself, to love your enemies, to respect the different sexes, both men and women, that we are to live in harmony since we're both created in God's image, to respect the different races, all being created in God's image, to serve and do good rather than to harm, to forgive rather than to hold grudges. I think we inherently know these things are right. So, as you describe the moral argument for God's existence, I want to encourage you to make your examples clear, right? Use things that are a little bit extreme. Maybe use the parallel of Hitler's Holocaust and Mother Teresa's work with orphans in Calcutta, just like I did a minute ago. Highlight the very different realities of those two people. Most of us know that one was right and one was wrong. And if somebody gives you pushback on that, pry a little bit. Make your examples clear. Ask them if they think torturing babies is okay. They probably can't say yes to that. Make your examples very clear. They know in their heart certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Okay? They know these things, and that should be pointing them to the existence of God. I want to make a quick little detour here into the problem of pain, and in a later session we'll deal with this more. But the fact that certain things are right and wrong points us to a creator, and that reminds paradox. God either wishes to take away evils and is unable, or he is able and unwilling, or he is neither willing nor able. In other words, if there's evil in the world, God is neither good nor all-powerful, or at least he can't be both, and so he can't be the Christian God that we follow. This falls apart, though, quite quickly, because as Christians we realize if anything is right and wrong, it points to God himself. Frank Turek puts it this way. He says that the atheist has to steal from God to make their point here. They have to assume a standard of right and wrong to refute the existence of God by claiming that he is not powerful enough to get rid of the evil that can exist without his existence. I also want to make a quick note that evil itself isn't something God created. It's the failure to measure up to the standard of who God is and what he's prescribed. So it's not something that he creates. It's like darkness is to light. It's the absence of light. It's not a physical quantity. All right, so as Christians, we know evil exists. We have hope in it. We know that there's a God in it all that's drawing us to himself and giving us peace in the middle of it. You know, when we realize that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, it's pointing us at the fact that God exists. The moral argument for God's existence is sharp and compelling. I hope that you have been encouraged by that today. I hope that you'll share this with your friends. I hope that you'll keep tuning in to the best facts training and all the sessions that are coming up. Thanks so much for watching today. Definitely get this at the Great Commission Alliance media channel on YouTube. We'll catch you again next time. Well, I'm so thankful that you tuned in to today's Best Facts training. It was exciting talking about some of these important topics. So we want to spend the next 15 minutes answering some of the questions that are coming in. Some of these have come in on YouTube, some through text message, things like that. So I'm going to try and address as many of them as I can. The first one that I saw on YouTube was just, aren't there facts that are accepted by both Christian and secular scholars? And I want to address that in regards to the engineering arguments and discussion that we just had. So yes, there are facts about that both Christian and secular scholars would agree on. So going even a little bit before the engineering argument to the beginning of the universe argument, because they're both involved here, the beginning of the universe is a fact that we can all agree on. There have been a tremendous number of scientific endeavors that have demonstrated again and again and again that the universe had a beginning a finite time ago. Some of those would include the cosmic microwave background radiation That's basically the afterglow of the beginning of the universe. You could almost think of it as food being warm 15 minutes after you're done cooking it. It still has some warmth to it. Well, the whole universe still has that radiation left over from the beginning of the universe. So that's one thing. The redshift of distant stars and galaxies, that was something that Hubble first demonstrated back in 1929, I believe. That redshift confirms that the universe is expanding in all directions. That expansion tells us that it had a beginning point. Side note to that, the Bible tells us that the universe is expanding many different times. We'll get into that in a future session when we talk about science in the Bible. But these are some of the different features that confirm the beginning event. There have recently been gravitational waves that have been empirically verified. You've probably heard about things like that in the news even in the last year or two. Some of these continue to confirm Einstein's theory of general relativity, as well as pointing at the fact that there was a beginning event that started the whole universe. Now, why this is important, scientists understand that there was a beginning event. I mean, that is an absolute fact by this point in our scientific endeavors. We know that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. That points directly to a cause, and like we said last time, that whatever caused the universe to exist must be all-powerful because it caused everything to exist. It must be timeless. In other words, time was created at the beginning, and so whatever created it all had to be timeless or eternal. Whatever created it all had to be self-existent. A good way to think about this is that whatever exists but not because of itself can't be a source of all existence. In other words, I had parents, you had parents, our parents had parents, their parents had parents. I don't naturally exist in my own self. Leibniz was famous for this kind of reasoning. But for me to exist, I had to be given existence by somebody else or something else with existence. And for anything to exist at all, there must be something that is self-existent in its own nature. So whatever caused this universe to begin must have been timeless, self-existent, eternal. It must have been all-powerful. It must have been creative and even had the capacity to make decisions. All these features, and there are many more, are directly related simply to the beginning event that science has confirmed. And all of those same features tell us kind of a picture-perfect description of the biblical view of God. So yeah, there are definitely things that both Christian and secular scholars would agree on concerning the beginning of the universe, also concerning the engineering or the incredible design in this universe. We read those quotes to you from Paul Davies and Hoyle that said there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. They said things like the numbers one calculates seem to put this beyond question. These incredible statements from world-renowned scientists that admit we see design in this universe. It's all around us. I also told you about Antony Flew. Antony Flew was a world-famous atheist skeptic that debated many Christian apologists. He debated Dr. William Lane Craig. He debated Dr. Gary Habermas. And by the time he died, I think he died in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, about 10 years ago. Right before he died, he came to believe in God. I don't think he ever became a Christian, but he came to believe in God because of the design evidence. So these design aspects that we just talked about today are things that both secular scientists and other thinkers and Christians can agree on. And I think that if we dig deep, we realize they point right at a creator. So yes, there are facts accepted by both Christians and secular scientists. Those were just a few. There are many more. You know, there was a question that came in last week, and before I go any deeper, I want to address that. And that was the census of Quirinius. How can we trust the Bible when it talks about the census of Quirinius that brought Jesus and his parents back to Bethlehem, even though there's no historical evidence for the census of Quirinius? You know, you probably have heard this statement before. An absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't yet found evidence for something doesn't mean that thing never happened. Let me give you another example. We also read in the New Testament about the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, and there is no evidence outside of Scripture for the slaughter of the innocents. But everything we know of Herod tells us that is exactly the kind of thing he would do. That statement about Herod is absolutely in line with what we know to be true of Herod, so there really is no reason to doubt it. Another thing that we need to remember is that Luke, where he can be tested, is always right. So Luke was a meticulous historian, talking about people and places and events and locations and all these things like that. He was meticulous in his historical scholarship, and because of that, we ought to be very careful before we just look the other way when he tells us about something. I would encourage you concerning Quirinius to go to coldcasechristianity.com and just type in Quirinius, Qurinius. And he has a great article on some of this that would explain it. Great apologist. I've interviewed him multiple times, and I encourage you to go read it. Let me just tell you kind of briefly what he says. First of all, he says Luke had access to eyewitnesses much earlier than Josephus did. So Josephus, who basically is the skeptics' front man for the idea that Quirinius didn't exist at this time or do the census at this time, he was writing anywhere from 20 to 40 years after Luke is writing. So Luke is writing as much as 4 decades earlier than him, and Luke is interviewing the people that were there for these events, while as Josephus is not. I might also mention that Josephus is a legitimate historian, and we like to quote him often because he does refer to Jesus, but historians of our day have also found discrepancies in some of Josephus's accounts. So this wouldn't be the only time Josephus has been wrong. And so if it's between Josephus and Luke, Luke broadly is more credible than Josephus, and he's writing up to 4 decades before Josephus. I'm not going to say Luke is wrong because Josephus, right? Also, if we go a little bit deeper, there is evidence for a Quirinius that had authority in those areas back at this time. As early as 11 BC up until the death of Herod, there is a coin and a statue that refer to this. And even though we don't have evidence of the specific census that Luke mentions for the birth of Christ, we know that there were many censuses like these at that time. And Luke definitely tells us of another census of Quirinius in Acts 5, which would be the one that Josephus refers to most likely. And so all this being said, it's not that Luke was wrong. It's just that Luke had more information, or was at least sharing more, than Josephus was discussing. And so again, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. We don't have any reason to doubt what Luke was saying, especially since we don't have to doubt him in other areas. Definitely go to Cold Case Christianity and see the article from J. Warner Wallace there on Quirinius. It's a good one. Some other engineering questions. Well, is design just the product of natural selection? That's a good question. It's one that comes up quite often, especially as it regards biological design. And the idea in evolution is that natural selection works on gradual mutations, preserving positive ones to create improvements for the species that are then passed on to the offspring. So you could see, if that were the case, increasing complexity and the appearance of increasing design through a natural process of natural selection and mutations. Now, the problem with this theory, though, is that natural selection does happen, that's a fact, but it always works with what already exists in the genetic pool. It doesn't create new features. So it whittles down, it doesn't add, it doesn't make new things. It might help beaks go from short to long, but it doesn't create a new feature on a bird's face, so to say. And so it's very rare to have a positive mutation at all. That's something that's very, very rare, but they do happen. But when they happen, they're bridge burning events. It's a cell losing something for an advantage, not getting something new. I would encourage you to read The Edge of Evolution by Michael Behe. It really goes in depth on this topic to describe what really natural selection could or could not be responsible for. But the bottom line is, we don't have any reason to believe that it could be responsible for all the biological diversity that we see and all the design or the appearance of design that's prevalent in biological systems. So I want to kind of deal with one more. Doesn't evolution, because we're talking about evolution, determine morality? And I hinted at this a bit. I briefly discussed it in today's session. I can't go too deep into this because we only have a few minutes left. But evolution does not account for morality. And here's kind of the way that the evolutionary morality idea goes. Supposedly, hundreds of thousands of years ago, whoever had a tendency towards rape or murder would have been kicked out of the village because people don't want to be around a rapist or a murderer. And so that person that got kicked out of the village wouldn't have been able to pass on their genes, which were responsible for their murderous and rapist tendencies. Whereas the people that stayed in the village were the ones that didn't have those genes, so those genes got passed down. So over time, the people with the genes that made them less likely to commit those heinous acts were the ones that propagated, and so their offspring were less likely and didn't feel prone to those acts either. That might sound good on paper, but in reality, it's not what we observe in history. It usually is the murderous, rapist tyrants that force their will on populations and do technically spread their genes. They are not necessarily the ones that would get kicked out of the village. So the evolutionary morality view assumes something that's really hard to assume. In fact, it kind of goes against the whole survival of the fittest narrative in the first place. But beyond all of that, even if we gave it to them and said, yeah, that's why we have certain moral feelings today, and I mentioned this in the session, that would not tell us that those moral feelings are justified. In other words, they would just be feelings that random mutations of different genes produced. It wouldn't tell us that murder is wrong, just that people feel it's wrong because those are the genes they inherited. It would give no one today a reason not to murder. And that's the thing with objective morality, is there is an ought to it. Why ought I do this and why ought I not do this? As Christians, we believe rape is always wrong and that is an objective fact, and murder is always wrong and that is an objective fact. So evolution doesn't get us that objective approach to morality. It gives us a subjective one at best, but I don't even think that the subjective description works. Hey, that's as much as we can deal with in today's Q&A. I hope you'll catch the next Best Facts training coming up next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Thanks for watching.